Okay, today we're starting with a new unit on text criticism. As you can see here, we've got a picture of the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament. This is from the book of Galatians, and you can see you've got the text here, and off to the side there are some marginal references to usually biblical texts. These are placed here because there may be an allusion to a biblical text, or maybe there's something that's parallel in one of Paul's other writings, for example, here, Romans 12:2. And so these marginal notes are actually, I find them really, really helpful sometimes, much more so than the references that you find in your English Bible or whatever. Okay, and then down here we have what is referred to as an apparatus. And this basically gives you all the information about the different variants, textual variants and things that occur. So you can see that it's full of all of this, what looks like gobbledygook right now, probably to you. But it's actually these little characters. Here's a Hebrew character, here's D, F, G. All of these represent different witnesses. Now, the ones here are all manuscripts. So we have Codex Sinaiticus. This is the second hand, so it wasn't the original copyist. Then we have Codex Bezae, 5th century manuscript. And then we've got these three uncial manuscripts, F, G, and H, all of the 9th century. This vid, this means that it appears that this manuscript reads this way. And here's another, what's called a uncial. So these are all uncial manuscripts, meaning that they are written in all caps. This is kind of an ancient writing style that we'll talk about later. And those are usually contrasted with minuscule manuscripts. Like here, we've got 365, 614, 1505. These are usually later manuscripts, and they're written in minuscule script, which is like a lowercase writing. We'll talk about that too later on. Okay, and what else? References to different versions. Like here you got the Vulgate, the Syriac. This is a particular translation known as the Peshitta. And then you've got another translation in Coptic known as Bohairic. References here to church fathers like Marcion, Tertullian, Lucifer, Cyprian, Ambrosiaster here. Okay, so that's just a little taste of what you find in the apparatus. As I said, I know it probably just looks like a bunch of gobbledygook right now, but hopefully by the end of these lectures, you'll be able to make better sense of those, of all this information. All right, well, textual criticism has been traditionally defined as the attempt to reconstruct a hypothetical original text by means of later texts, whether those texts be manuscript copies, translations, quotes, and excerpts, maybe from the church fathers, or paraphrases, and so forth. So what we're trying to do when we talk about this hypothetical original text, we're talking about the autograph. An autograph is not just when you give your personal signature. When text critics refer to autographs, they're talking about the original manuscript that was produced by the apostle or the apostolic man, whoever it was that was writing the book of the New Testament. Of course, it doesn't have to just be the New Testament books, but just any author, when he wrote down his book, you end up with what's called an autograph. But text criticism can also be defined as an attempt to reconstruct how the text has developed over the years. And this fits in more with what's known as reception history. Reception history is the attempt to keep track of how a particular text, or sometimes a book, was received in different parts of the world over the years. So you might look at, for example, how John 1:1 was understood in the 2nd century in France, in Italy, in Asia Minor, whatever, and then move into the 3rd century and explore the same issue. 4th century, looking at various testimonies from church fathers, from church councils, or whatever other evidence that you can garner to try to put together a reconstruction of how this text was used and understood over the centuries. Okay, so that's known as reception history. So text criticism can be used for that reason too. So that there's not just one definition of text criticism. We have at least two, and two different goals that we're aiming toward. And so that's important to keep in mind. Now, to engage in text criticism is to assume that the autograph is no longer available. This is something that everyone should agree about, whether you are a hardcore skeptic of the Bible or an evangelical Christian, whatever your ideology might be. We all have to recognize that the autographs have perished. We don't have those. And that's why we have text criticism, because we're aiming to get back to those autographs. Now, to use text criticism in order to reconstruct the autograph is to assume that this is a reasonable goal. But some text critics don't use text criticism in this way. They claim instead that since the autographs of the New Testament have perished, it's unrealistic to think that we can actually reconstruct them, even with the help of text criticism. And you have certain scholars like David Parker, Bart Ehrman, Eldon Epp, and others who take this perspective. Now, from this perspective, our goal should not be to reconstruct a hypothetical original, but simply to map some of the textual traditions that have emerged over the centuries. So what they're saying is that we can't get back to this here, the autographs. What we can do is we can chart some of the text traditions that emerged over the years, right? You got the Alexandrian family of manuscripts, the Western family, and the Byzantine family. And we can try to explore, which came first, how things developed, all that sort of thing. Usually they say that these came much later. So you have the Alexandrian and the Western families being the earliest, maybe the Western being second, Alexandrian being first, and then seeing how all of these traditions branched off into other traditions. Okay, so that's kind of their perspective. Now, this issue of whether the autographs can or cannot be reconstructed has a lot to do with how far removed one assumes that the extant manuscripts are from the autographs. Let me give you an illustration here. Imagine if I were to write a little booklet of about 20,000 words. And since I don't really like my handwriting, I asked my friend Bill if he wouldn't mind copying out the whole thing by hand. For some reason, he agrees to do this. So he copies out the whole manuscript, and I'm just really impressed by this. I'm like, oh man, this is way better than my handwriting. So I take my original manuscript and I just toss it into the fireplace, and I say, hey, let me buy you a drink, Bill. And he says, okay, and we get into my car and we head off to the pub. But on the way, there's this bushy-tailed squirrel that jumps out into the road. And so I swerve my car and lose control of the vehicle, and we both go careening off of a cliff, and we both die. Don't worry, though. It was a painless death. Anyway, the police and rescue workers show up on the scene, and they take away the wreckage and the bodies, and they notify my brothers that they had retrieved a manuscript from the car. So my brothers come to the police station, and my brother Chris, when he sees the manuscript, says, oh, interesting. Before Michael died, he wrote a little booklet. See here, it says, What You Need to Know About Text Criticism by Michael Flowers. Then Paul, my other brother, says, that doesn't look like Michael's handwriting. I think someone else wrote this booklet and just put our brother's name on it. Then Chris says, why would anyone have done that? It's not like our brother was famous or anything. Besides, this sounds like something Michael would have written. Wasn't he always going on about textual criticism? And Paul says, yeah, I guess. But maybe someone else copied this manuscript and in the process made a bunch of changes to it. Unless we can find the original manuscript, I just don't see how we can ever know for sure that this accurately reflects what Michael himself wrote. Now, that might sound like a ridiculous argument, but it's not illogical. It's true that my brothers could never know for certain that the copy of my manuscript that they had accurately preserved what I had written. For all they knew, the copyist totally altered my words, putting every sentence into his own style and changing other parts however he saw fit. We're kind of in the same situation when it comes to the autographs of the New Testament. These autographs have perished. So if someone were to take a hard-lined, skeptical position, claiming that we can't know for certain whether the extant witnesses accurately preserve what the authors themselves wrote, well, he'd be right. As in the story I just mentioned, my brother Paul believed that the copy of my booklet was either a complete forgery or a corruption of what I had originally written. My brother Chris believed otherwise, but if Paul wanted to remain skeptical, there's nothing that Chris could have told him to convince him to change his view. My point here is just to emphasize that an element of faith needs to be maintained whenever we engage in text criticism. At the same time, I do think it's overly skeptical to assume that the extant witnesses, especially the really early ones, are so far removed from the originals that we can't have any confidence about what the authors themselves wrote. Also, what you'll usually find is that people who take this kind of hard skeptical view are often inconsistent in the way that they treat other ancient works. Now, as far as the New Testament books are concerned, no one believes that we can get back to the originals in every respect. We'll always have some uncertainties. Nevertheless, given the large number of early witnesses at our disposal, we're clearly in a secure place text critically. And because of this, I think that we're still able to reconstruct a form of the New Testament which, in its essence and in virtually all of its particulars, preserves what its many authors themselves wrote nearly 2,000 years ago.